Hello, YouTube enjoyers. Hope you're all doing well. Quick introduction before I get into the meat of the video. I do invasions in Elden Ring and post clip compilations, usually trying to highlight interactions that I thought were interesting, funny, or skillful, at least by my standards. So if you like that sort of thing, consider following my channel for more. And if you hate that sort of thing, consider dropping a lengthy comment about how PvP ruins Elden Ring and I should rethink my life. Thank you very much. And a really quick side note regarding the format of this video. Just like the previous one, I'll be playing some muted, unedited footage of invasions in the background, but you should be able to listen to this audio only, like some sort of podcast almost, if that's more your jam. So this is actually a sort of companion video to one that I put out a few days ago, and in that first video I gave my thoughts regarding the use of external information such as guides, wikis, and forums when it comes to first playthroughs of Elden Ring. And the basic thesis of that video was nobody cares, or rather should care, whether you get that help from the internet. Approach the game however is most enjoyable for you, and find your own meaning in the experience. And obviously, there's more complexity and nuance to my position than that, seeing as that first video was about 27 minutes long. So if you want to hear me ramble about that more at length, consider going back and checking that video out as well. And I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but considering that we're kind of dealing with the gamer crowd here, I do not view my experiences or opinions with Souls games as definitive or sacred in any way. I'm not trying to prescribe to anybody how they should engage with FromSoft's games. You should definitely make those determinations for yourself. But with all that prefacing out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the meat of the video. For this video, I want to focus on another frequently debated form of assistance in Souls games, and that's the co-op summons. The yellow phantoms that you can summon to offer you a hand if you're struggling to progress an area of the game, or if you're kind of ramming yourself up against a boss over and over, or if you just kind of want some company as you go through the sort of desolate world of these games. I am mostly going to be making a few cases against how members of the community behave towards others as a consequence of their experiences and mentalities. And I'm going to try to holistically point out why those behaviors are just uncalled for and kind of frivolous and really should be examined critically. So across the entire line of From Software's games, there has been a pervasive, recurring discourse regarding whether the ability to summon a random player or a friend into your game for assistance somehow diminishes the player experience, particularly on their first run through the games. Or if it somehow strays away from or even undermines the intent of the developers, or if it's just so poorly implemented that it couldn't possibly be meant to be used. There's no shortage of arguments that have been made to these effects, but the common thrust of them is that all players, particularly new players, should stay away from summoning at all costs, lest their victories be worthy of derision or viewed as illegitimate. And right off the bat, I'll just say none of this is true, and you should not place that kind of overbearing standard upon yourself if you are just getting into these games and you happen to be struggling in some way. There is nobody looking over your shoulder as you play these games, and you shouldn't feel beholden to, like people on Reddit who are just too volatile when it comes to this topic. Just kind of put that out of your mind if you're able to. But unfortunately, you're still going to hear a lot of content creators and community members reinforcing these attitudes towards cooperative play. And this often seems to be done in a way that is rather inconsiderate of how those attitudes can have an overall negative impact on a newer player's experience and perception of these games. And this hostility towards co-op will often get laundered through talking points like, oh, these games are like life. They're meant to be hard and test you. Think about that next time you play them, maybe. Don't you want to be able to take on life? Consider that you took the easy way out. Do you take the easy way out in life? Maybe you didn't know you were cheating yourself out of the intended experience. Maybe you'll get it right next time if you just try harder. And I recognize I might be strawmanning a bit here, but I'm just trying to communicate the arrogance behind these attitudes and how they kind of come off to somebody observing from the outside. And if you're like me and you've kind of been in proximity to this community attitude for a long time, it becomes pretty easy to observe how cooperative players are treated as naive, ignorant, fragile individuals who just don't have the skills, perseverance, or attitude towards life to properly engage with the developer's intended experience. To kind of punctuate my point here, I would actually refer to a video by Noah Caldwell Gervais, who is a fantastic video game analyst and essayist. And in that video, he is talking about his first experiences with the Dark Souls games. And at one point, he says something to the effect of, don't try to tell a part-time worker that life is hard. They know. And I think that's a pretty succinct way of countering what I was just describing about how these games are intrinsically reflective of life itself. But yeah, you should totally go give that video a watch. I'll link it up in the corner here. It's a few hours long, I think, so a bit of a lengthier listen, but I think it's really great and goes into great detail about a novice's experience with Souls-likes. So yeah, highly recommend that. And that kind of wraps what I wanted to say regarding the community context around cooperative play and sort of how it exists in the online space that has grown around the Souls games over time. And I think it's a little sad and unfortunate that this is so pervasive and constant, similar to what I was describing in the video about guides. It's never really gone away or evolved, and the dialogue or discourse about this has never improved or moved forward in any way, and is just always superfluous, useless. Nobody learns anything, and if you ask me, it's a waste of your neurons, and you should stay away from it for your own sanity. And my general reaction whenever I see this kind of discourse pop up from time to time is, what the hell are you talking about? Touch grass, I beg of you, please. And I wish I could leave it at that and be confident I've made my point, but as I've said previously, we're dealing with gamers, and gamers are just the worst. And for this next, I guess you could call it section of the video, I want to dial in a bit on something that I also briefly surfaced in the guides video, which is developer intent, or rather what people perceive to be developer intent. I'll kind of start off by just giving it straight from the horse's mouth with a quote from Miyazaki that has been around for a while and occasionally gets brought up again, but it doesn't seem that the sentiment behind it has really stuck. And this is an anecdote from Miyazaki concerning the inspiration for the Souls co-op system. And that story goes, quote, "The origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone could get home. Then it was my turn, and everybody started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd have just got stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way back home, I wondered whether the last person in line had made it home, and thought that I would probably never meet the people who had helped me. I thought that maybe if we'd met each other in another place, we'd become friends, or maybe we'd just fight. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time. Simply because it's fleeting, I think it stays with you a lot longer, like the cherry blossoms we Japanese love so much." End quote. So this pretty effectively encapsulates the overarching philosophy behind Miyazaki's inclusion of cooperative play in the Souls games. The idea of transience is really apt, in my opinion, because in a lot of cases, co-op summons are random players who you don't personally know. And yes, you can summon a friend, of course, but most of the time, it's somebody you have not met and probably will not meet again. But despite that fleeting nature of the interaction, there is still hope that playing alongside somebody will provide a unique sort of camaraderie and connection. And that can make a huge difference for new players trying to navigate the vast, dead, empty worlds of Souls games, particularly with Elden Ring, which is so large and provides so little guidance on where to go and what lies beyond. And I personally think that this might strengthen a new player's relationship with these games in the long run, because they had this momentary, probably one-time interaction with somebody who was willing to help them unconditionally for really nothing in return. And I think that's something that's pretty unique to the Souls games that you really can't get anywhere else. It's worth keeping in mind, and most longtime Souls players will already know this, but the co-op mechanics have been present in every Souls game all the way back to Demon Souls. And FromSoft has had every opportunity to de-emphasize, redesign, or outright eliminate this side of the games. But they haven't. So I think it's pretty safe to take that at face value and conclude that these mechanics are in fact part of the lauded developer intent. Or at least it's something that they are permissive of or have planned for. And it's more difficult than you would think to actually get people to agree on this fundamental conclusion, despite it being pretty evidently communicated. If you ask me, there's still this ongoing back and forth concerning whether the co-op systems are really and truly part of FromSoft's intended game design. And this is where we get back into the muddy waters of what people allege is quote unquote developer intent. I tried to kind of describe this in the guides video, but the majority of the time when you see the phrase developer intent thrown around online, particularly with games that have a reputation for being difficult or have high skill ceilings, majority of the time that phrase is being used as kind of a stand-in to legitimize somebody else's mindset or personal rule set in regards to that particular game. And I don't want to veer too far into this sort of death of the author-esque territory, because I think that quickly diminishes in value the further down the rabbit hole you go. But I think that developer intent is kind of a dangerous topic because it'll devolve so quickly into trying to determine what isn't developer intent, kind of this negative framing of it. And that means that inherently more things are going to fall outside of this alleged intent than within it. I've grown so frustrated with this intent debate that I'm of the mindset nowadays that developer intent is kind of besides the point when it comes to engaging meaningfully with a video game. I would obviously add the caveat that there are games out there where developers have stated, we want the players to experience XYZ, or we want them to be able to approach the experience in ABC fashion. And that's perfectly valid. Devs should always be given space to clarify those design rationale behind any given game mechanic. It's sometimes crucial that they do so in order to provide people realistic expectations of their product, which is ultimately what a video game is a product. But even with all that in mind, I still believe that you should not approach a game, whether it's a Souls game or otherwise, with the expectation that you're going to try and adhere to a plan or a stringent guide for how a developer wants you to move through it. To sort of reinforce that, I would argue that Miyazaki's sole intention with these games is not to provide you a frustrating struggle that is going to somehow reshape you into a better gamer or whatever. Miyazaki's main goal is to provide a space for players to have meaningful experiences regardless of how they get those experiences. And if you focus too much on the vehicle by which somebody gets meaning out of these games, I think it quickly starts to detract from the actual appeal of them. And I think this applies double to Elden Ring, which, compared to the rest of the FromSoft catalog, has a vast amount of player freedom and optionality in terms of stuff from your character's build to how you engage with NPC quest lines to what tactics you use to beat a really difficult boss. And the co-op system, in parallel with that, is presented every step of the way via the summoning pools. And there are a range of items presented to you that can, at any point in your playthrough, provide a means to engage with other players. And I think that pretty clearly signals that the online component is a deliberate inclusion in this game. If I recall correctly, there was actually a still image used in the initial marketing for Elden Ring that depicted three players overlooking the Liurnia of the Lakes vista that you get right after Stormvale Castle. And I think it's pretty hard to argue that the cooperative side of things was not considered in the game when FromSoft very clearly broadcasted that dimension of the game as part of its appeal. And if we want to get really nitpicky, pedantic with this whole thing, there's no separate trophy for beating the game solo versus with help. And overall, I think that Elden Ring actually puts forward the cooperative elements of the game more prominently than the rest of the Souls games. Part of this is attributable to the presence of the spirit summons mechanic, which I'm not going to focus too much on that here because it's really just adjacent to this topic, but the inclusion of it does support the idea that FromSoft wanted players to be able to access help at any point in their playthrough. And whether that's online or offline is not really the point, but I don't think you can, in good faith, argue that having assistance is outside of From's vision. To just cap off this part of the video, I think what we can say, execution aside, is that FromSoft, Miyazaki were definitely intending for Elden Ring's players to have the option to experience their games alongside another person. In their eyes, the ability to do so does not take away from the ability of the game to provide meaningful experiences. So yeah, those are my not so brief thoughts on developer intent and how it relates to the co-op systems. So now I'd like to redirect a little bit to the actual execution and implementation of the co-op mechanics in Elden Ring. And upfront, I'll say that Elden Ring's online systems are far from perfect, or even sensible in some specific cases. There are clearly some areas of the experience that were not either thoroughly tested or considered prior to launch. And this has resulted in some somewhat glaring issues since the game's release in the couple years since then, particularly in terms of the invader experience. And I'm not going to dive into the invader side of things here. Again, I might do a separate video on that, but there are obvious kinks in the system, and we should definitely continue to acknowledge those kinks. I'm definitely of the opinion that if you really love something and you want to see it be sustained and flourish over time, you need to be able to constructively assess it and criticize it. But I don't think that these flaws in implementation somehow post hoc make the case that cooperative play is just not meant to be used. And if you ask me, the primary problem with cooperative play, and there's different ways to sort of break this down, but very simply put, the issue is that any host with the use of password summons can bring in an over-leveled partner, somebody that, for instance, is max level and is able to just absolutely steamroll the level and likely the bosses for them. And this can result in sort of the host getting a babysitter that allows them to just breeze through the game without really accumulating any level of skill along the way. And I think there is something to be said for being able to learn a game's mechanics and building your skills as you move through it. I do think there is value to that. But at the same time, it's, I don't think, morally wrong or weaker to play through the game with somebody. And by this, I mean specifically with somebody at your level. I think that the ability to summon somebody who is max level to help you is bordering on egregious in some cases, and I would prefer it if it were restrained in some way. Like maybe there's a max deviation from your level for who you can password summon, or maybe the downscaling, which has always been broken in Souls games, is more severe or something to that effect. But I think really that's the one thing that cooperative play does actually do to detract from the Elden Ring experience. But am I going to chastise somebody for playing the game that way? Absolutely not. As an invader, obviously, I would prefer it if I could know going into an invasion that a host isn't going to have an overleveled phantom that can one-shot me. Of course, I would vastly prefer that to the current situation we have. But that aside, I don't think it's worthy of derision. I'll also admit that were I to know somebody who did play the game that way, and I haven't personally, but if I did, I probably would do a little bit to encourage them to consider playing the game differently, even if it's just a matter of, oh, if you want somebody to help you, maybe don't make it somebody that is 300 levels higher than you, or anything like that. I'll fess up to that. Like, I'm not completely without, I guess you could say, hypocrisy on this one. One thing that often gets bandied around a lot is that the augmentation that happens with cooperative play is too much for a first playthrough with the game. There are a lot of testimonials online that you can easily find of people praising Elden Ring for providing such a special first playthrough, and it was that way for me as well, and I don't think I'll ever be able to replicate or recreate that first experience. I mean, who knows with the DLC, maybe it'll absolutely blow our socks off, who knows. But it's not for us to police what makes somebody's first playthrough very special. And if that first playthrough is special enough, they might come back to the game, even though the majority of players do only play through Elden Ring once. Still, the ones that get that much out of the game, even with cooperative play, if they come back, they're pretty likely to try and approach it differently, I would assume, because why else would they come back? Just to get the same experience all over again. And people coming back to Elden Ring is only good for the game's lifespan. Whether they are coming back to try it solo for the first time or to play through it again with other people, the fact that they come back is a net positive for the game and will help to ensure that it doesn't wither and die. And it's just logical that if more people come to the game to play cooperatively, there will be more people to play cooperatively with. And that, again, is just a good thing. Even if some people don't like that people are approaching the game that way, more people playing the game is always good. And of course, if you play through the game with random summons or a friend, it is obviously going to augment your experience. But I think that type of immersion is still immersion at the end of the day. And it goes back to what From's priority is, which is that you achieve a state of meaning in the game. And if that meaning branches from being with somebody else, or having help, or even just having someone alongside you, then I think that is perfectly valid and isn't something you should feel self-conscious about. When you see that enemy defeated appear on your screen, you have earned that, no matter how you got there. I said the same thing in the guides video. Whether you are doing research or seeking information or directly bringing someone in to provide assistance, you got it. You got your victory. And that is not lessened because you chose X way of getting there. I do not believe that by getting assistance in this game, you are signing up for an inherently broken, incomplete, unintended experience. And I think trying to argue that is just silly, quite honestly. You do not need to try to be this stalwart struggler who overcomes all obstacles in their path by sheer willpower with nobody helping them. And that's kind of what I wanted to say about how co-op might influence your experience with Elden Ring, and maybe that's something for people to consider in how they plan to play the game for the first time, or how they plan to experience the DLC for the first time here in a few days. But that's kind of the summary of my thoughts on that particular topic. I also want to quickly acknowledge invasions in the mix here, as they're intrinsically tied to the co-op system. When you summon phantoms into your game for help, you open yourself up to being invaded by another player, an invader, and it's their job to try and stop you from progressing by killing you, or at least eliminate your phantoms or diminish your resources. Many people kind of think of them as mini-bosses of sorts. They are there to provide some counterbalance to hosts getting help from others. Obviously, as an avid invader, I want there to be co-opers for me to invade, whether they're genuinely playing through the level or deliberately ganking as a group. And while there is a way for solo hosts to bring invaders in via the Taunter's Tongue item, the majority of invasions are with co-op groups. And the thing is, alongside that, there are a number of NPC invaders throughout Elden Ring, some of which are tied to prominent quest lines, and I believe all of which provide unique rewards that you can't get elsewhere in the game. So I think with this in mind, you can intuit that player invasions are also an intended mechanic, and those NPC invasions in the offline mode are there to give a sort of taste test for what it's like to engage with another player, albeit in a very pared back fashion. The NPC invaders are nowhere near as difficult to beat as an actual person, but I think you can make that connection pretty organically. So I would argue that if you are of the opinion that co-op is not intended or just kind of an appendage on the game, then by extension, you have to make that case for invasions. And frankly, I don't think anyone is able to argue that position coherently. Anyway, that just occurred to me as I was trying to wrap up this script, and I wanted to kind of garnish my points with it a little bit. Again, I might do a video regarding invasions specifically. I don't know, but I'm not going to dive into it here. This video is already long enough as it is. but I hope this kind of makes sense and provides an additional flavor to my arguments. Before I move into the wrap-up portion of the video, I wanted to quickly spotlight something that actually came out while I was writing this script. So, in a recent interview with PC Gamer, Miyazaki was asked his thoughts on the seamless co-op mod for the PC version of Elden Ring. For those that don't already know, the seamless co-op mod makes it possible to play all of Elden Ring contiguously from beginning to end with a partner. So no fog walls will interrupt your experience. People don't get booted from the game when you beat a boss. It's just a single end-to-end experience and allows you to avoid interruptions. And those interruptions and getting kicked out and needing to rejoin a host's game over and over is a prevalent complaint with the implementation of co-op in Elden Ring. So anyway, the interviewer asked Miyazaki for his perspective on this seamless co-op mod and what he thinks about experiencing the game this way. And Miyazaki said, quote, "It's definitely not something we actively oppose or want to downplay, wanting to go through the whole game together. In terms of where we were with Elden Ring, it was simply a case of wanting that more loose, casual style, drop in, defeat a boss, drop out. It doesn't put any technical restrictions on the player, it just sort of lets them complete this focus and then move on, so to speak. That's not to say we don't consider other ways like you and your friend played, from beginning to end, total co-op. That's not to say we won't consider ideas like that with our future games." End quote. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly include that here because I thought the timing was funny, obviously, but also I think this input from Miyazaki is worthy of being brought up in the future in the discourse regarding cooperative play and whether FromSoft intended it or not. And I'll be sure to include the link to that PC Gamer interview down in the description. It's a very short read, so you won't have to dig very deep to find those quotes, but just so you can see it for yourself, what Miyazaki was quoted as saying. And with that, I think I've covered everything of importance to me when it comes to Elden Ring's co-op. In summary, I think there is no reason to view that side of the game as lesser or worthy of derision. Follow your own path to a meaningful experience with Elden Ring, and all games for that matter. You don't need anyone else's blessing or permission to engage with the game in a way that's enjoyable to you, whether that's on your own or with partners. And I'll cap this off with what I said at the end of the previous video. Nobody cares. Get your victory. Find your own meaning, not somebody else's. Thanks for watching.